Hello and welcome. I'm Jens Stehner with the Getty Villa Museum in Los Angeles, California, home to Getty's collection of Greek, Roman, and Etruscan art. We acknowledge that the land Getty inhabits today was once known as Tova Angar. We pay respect to the Gabrieleño Tongva people and honor their labor as original caretakers of this land. Now, today's program complements the exhibition Ancient Thrace and the Classical World, Treasures from Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece, which opened earlier this month at the Getty Villa and will be on view through March 3rd, 2025. Now, today, we will take a closer look at the Thracians, the people inhabiting ancient Thrace, and I'm pleased to welcome our speaker, Dr. Matthew Sears. Matthew A. Sears is professor of classics at the University of New Brunswick in Canada. He has explored cross-cultural interactions between peoples of the core and periphery in the ancient world, especially the Athenians and Thracians, and writes about how ancient cultures remember and commemorate their pasts. He's the author of several books, including Athens, Thrace, and the Shaping of Athenian Leadership, Understanding Greek Warfare, and Battles and Battlefields of Ancient Greece. And his latest is called Sparta and the Commemoration of War, which was published earlier this year by Cambridge University Press. Matthew Sears received his PhD from Cornell University. I also want to mention that he contributed an essay to the catalog for our current exhibition, Ancient Thrace and the Classical World. And now, please join me in welcoming Matthew to the screen. Please, Matthew, take it away.
Thank you, Jens, for that very kind and generous introduction. And thank you to all of the Getty staff who have helped put this together and invited me to speak with you all today. I'm very honored to be asked to do so. And I also want to thank you all at the Getty and thank the Getty itself for putting on this important exhibition. I think, and I hope we will all agree by the end of today's talk, that the Thracians are fascinating, they're intriguing, and they're important in a way that far exceeds their presence in popular culture. Unless you're a specialist or happen to live in an area of the world where the ancient Thracians once lived, it's likely that you haven't heard much about the Thracians except for a few snippets here and there. And I am grateful to the Getty for starting to rectify that situation. And I hope many people leave here today with a greater appreciation of this people or groups of people, and of how interesting those people who we tend to think of as on the edge or periphery of the Greek and Roman worlds, how great it can be to explore those peoples in their own right. So I'm grateful to that. So today we're going to spend some time talking about who the Thracians were and what their place was in the wider ancient Mediterranean world, specifically the world characterized by ancient Greek and Roman civilizations, the world that has been an integral part to the education curriculum for many people around the world, especially in Western Europe and North America. Certainly my own education focused a lot on ancient Greece and Rome, from the middle school level and through college and university. And so the Thracians were very much a part of that world, and I hope to touch on a little bit about their reach, their importance, who they were, the things that they thought were important, but also what I tend to find the most interesting part of these kinds of studies. I want to touch on how we know what we know about the Thracians. And in this case, maybe more specifically, what don't we know and what can we do in light of the fact that the evidence is often lacking, and the evidence that we do have, as we'll see, doesn't come from the Thracians at all. Even the cup we see on the screen right now is from classical Athens. This is an Attic red figure piece of pottery depicting how an Athenian or an Athenian audience thought about the Thracians and how they looked. And so this is the kind of source that we tend to be limited with, but there are some reasons for hope that we might understand some more in the future. But let's start today with something about the Thracians that doesn't put them in a particularly good light. But what it does do, I think it sets the scene well in terms of how those we do know well, or at least better, the ancient Greeks, specifically the ancient Athenians, viewed these people living to their north. So most of the people in the audience today will have heard about the Peloponnesian War between Athens and its empire and Sparta and its allies, fought at the end of the 400s BCE, 27-year-long conflict that really did a lot to shape the classical Greek, Mediterranean, and Aegean, especially worlds. In the middle of that war, during a lull in the fighting, a technical period of peace between Athens and Sparta, the Athenians undertook what turned out to be very ill-advised invasion of Sicily, with the idea of conquering Syracuse, the third most powerful Greek city in the Mediterranean world, and even perhaps conquering the entire island of Sicily itself, a huge island, the largest in the Mediterranean, home to Greeks, native Sicels, Carthaginians, and others. While the Athenians and their allies were setting sail, a group of mercenaries, soldiers for hire from Thrace, and we'll talk about where that is in a few moments, but think of it now to the north of most of the Greek world, to the north of the Aegean Sea. A group of Thracian soldiers for hire showed up to take part in this expedition, paid for by the Athenians, but they showed up too late to sail with the main fleet. And so it turned out that the Athenians thought that this group couldn't be of much help. They weren't interested in continuing to pay their mercenary salaries. And so they sent them back to the North Aegean and to Thrace under the command of an Athenian. So these are Thracian mercenaries, and they are being commanded by an Athenian who is charged with leading them back home. But they thought while they're sailing back north across the Aegean, they might as well inflict as much damage as they can on any enemies of Athens that they happen to come across. And the first major enemy of Athens that they passed were those Greeks living in Boeotia, the area just to the north of where Athens is located, and dominated by the important Greek polis of Thebes. But it's not Thebes that these Thracian soldiers for hire attacked. It was a tiny town called Mycalessus, just a kilometer or so inland from the coast, and so easy pickings for a seaborne invasion. Now, Mycalessus and its people did not expect to be involved in any major conflicts of the Peloponnesian War, and they were so ill-prepared for any kind of attack or military action that they had let the city walls fall into a state of disrepair. And so into this city or town and its crumbling walls, these hundreds of Thracian mercenaries poured in and started killing indiscriminately. They killed men, women, children, and perhaps even more shockingly, they just started slaughtering any livestock they came across. They killed even the animals. And most horrifying and all too common when war has taken a turn for the worst, and war begins in a bad place and often, as we have seen, descends to worse places. These Thracians entered into a boys' school that was currently in session and killed every student they came across inside. Now, the Thebans, not too far away, eventually heard of what was happening to this town of Mycalessus, and they dispatched a squadron of cavalry to deal with these mercenary invaders. Thucydides, the Athenian who wrote the account of what happened at Mycalessus, tells us that the Thracians, and he adds, like any barbarian race, were all the more confident because things were going well. They had a very easy set of targets, and they were attacking defenseless sitting ducks. And so they were having a great time of it, which gives us a sense of how Athenians, like Thucydides, thought about non-Greek or barbarian peoples like the Thracians. But when these Theban cavalry forces arrived, the Thracians began retreating back to their ships, but the Thebans killed a great many of them because these Thracians were too busy looting and killing defenseless people, including children, to be able to deal with actually well-equipped and well-trained soldiers. Eventually, the survivors did make it back to their ships, and they continued on their way, I suppose under the direction still of their Athenian commander, back to Thrace and out of the Athenian payroll. Thucydides tells us at the close of this episode that the disaster that fell upon this town was greater than any other that happened in the war. And this war, remember, was 27 years long and included many terrible disasters and was more unexpected and more terrible. As a historian, Thucydides is fond of paradigms. And by that, I mean he would focus in on a particular example of something, whether it's civil war, whether it's hoplite battle, or whether it's, in this case, a massacre, in order to illustrate what all other similar events would have been like. And so the disaster that happened to Mycalessus was for him so terrible that the reader who encountered this episode would then have a clearer picture in their mind of what all the other terrible things that happened during the Peloponnesian War must have been like. This is not the kind of paradigm, this is not the kind of example that any community would want to represent for the world at a time of war. And it's also a paradigm or example of the dangers presented by relying on soldiers for hire instead of citizen soldiers fighting for one's own home. And in particular, soldiers for hire from non-Greek places, or as the Greeks would have referred to them, from barbarian places. And so we have here an example or a paradigm of what happens when barbarians are let loose in a time of war, even if their commanders happen to be Greek. And scholars who study this episode see it as a showcase of the moral decline that Athens was experiencing this far into the war, that yes, Thracians participated and committed this massacre, but it was the Athenian moral rot that led to it in the first place by Athens relying on these terrifying barbarians from the north. It's, of course, more complicated than that in the case of Mycalessus and Thucydides' account of it, because Thucydides himself had a Thracian mother, or father, rather. Thucydides' father's name was Olorus, which is a very strange name for an Athenian, and it's a name that was shared by a Thracian king. It seems that Thucydides was descended from Thracian nobility, and he himself had estates in what we would consider today to be Thrace. So Thucydides himself was perhaps half Thracian or a quarter Thracian. And so even while he's calling out these mercenaries for their, quote, barbarous tendencies and behaviors, he himself was of Thracian extraction. And that really brings home the interconnected nature of the Greeks and the Thracians and many other Mediterranean peoples and the Thracians, including some of the most famous and influential and elite Greeks, including the author Thucydides himself. So let's look at some more of these examples of Thracians and how they appear in Greek sources, especially, and the Greek imagination. Here we have another red figure bit of pottery. And on this pottery, we see an episode that is portrayed in Homer's Iliad, in which the heroes Diomedes and Odysseus, most famous for the other Homeric epic, the Odyssey, conduct a night raid against the Trojans, especially against Trojan allies that are encamped outside of the impenetrable walls of Troy. And one of these set of allies were a group of Thracians under a king named Rhesus. And Diomedes and Odysseus came upon these Thracian allies of the Trojans while they were asleep, and then proceeded to slaughter every single one of them, including King Rhesus himself, and then take away a marvelous prize, which any Greek hero would have been happy to have, Rhesus's prized horses. And that's what we see on the bottom frame of this vessel. We see them, the Greeks, leading away these prized horses. And then in the upper frame, we see the dead Thracians splayed along the ground. Now, one thing you'll notice immediately in terms of how the Athenians and other Greeks tended to depict themselves and others is that the heroic Greeks are nude. They're wearing, of course, cloaks, and they have weapons, but generally they are nude. Sometimes you will see heroes wearing armor and other military equipment and so on. But you'll see that the Thracians are wearing very different apparel. They have striped trousers. They have funny hats. They're carrying different equipment. And so we can immediately tell, even if there weren't inscriptions, which there are on this vase, that these are Thracians, or at least some kind of northern or eastern, quote, barbarian people rather than Greeks. In the historical period, Thracian mercenaries could also be involved in less terrible episodes of military nature than the massacre at Mycalessus. After the Peloponnesian War, in the year 390 BCE, the Athenians were still hiring Thracian mercenaries to serve on their military campaigns. And in this case, near ancient Corinth, a group of Thracian mercenaries under the command of an Athenian attacked an entire contingent of Spartan hoplites, which were supposed to be the deadliest and most fearsome soldiers in the world. And these Thracians managed to utterly wipe out and humiliate this group of Spartan hoplites in a way that both shocked and humiliated the Spartans, but also surprised the rest of the Greek world and suggested ways, tactically speaking, that the Spartans could be beaten. The reason why the Athenians and many other Greeks hired Thracian mercenaries is because they fought in a way that was different than Greeks tended to fight. When we think about Greek warriors, we think of the hoplite soldier with a large round shield and a sturdy thrusting spear, fighting in a densely packed phalanx. Of course, the Greeks fought in many other ways too, but that hoplite phalanx was the most prominent, or certainly the most culturally prolific or prevalent mode of fighting in the ancient Greek world. The Thracians had a type of soldier called the peltast, named after a small crescent-shaped shield called a pelte that was made out of wicker work with canvas stretched over it instead of a big, heavy hoplite shield. And this peltast tended to throw javelins, so small throwing spears rather than wield large thrusting spears. And so they could attack at medium range. They could swarm in against their enemy and hurl javelins before retreating again to safety and regrouping and then attacking again. And these are exactly the sorts of tactics that they used in 390 near Corinth against seemingly invincible Spartan hoplites. And this style of fighting was a good complement to hoplite soldiers, so much so that eventually Greeks started training as peltasts in their own right, deriving this tactical style and equipment from the Thracians that they had hired as mercenaries and fought against and with for quite some time by the time of the Peloponnesian. and afterwards. In Athens, it seems that the Thracians held a certain fascination or appeal for the Athenians, especially elite Athenians. And this is what my first book, and which was based on my doctoral dissertation, was about, was a group of Athenians that Aristophanes, the great comic playwright, dubbed Thrace haunters, a group of people that haunted or stalked or hung around in Thrace. You know, if you think about teenage mall rats, these were mall rats, but in Thrace. Thrace rats, perhaps we can call them. And we see this in literary sources. We also see it in artistic media of various sorts. What we see here on the screen is the tondo, or inside of a cup that's now in Munich. And you see a young man riding a horse. His undergarments are typically Greek, and he's wearing a hat called a petasos that Greeks would frequently wear, especially while traveling. But his cloak might strike the eye. This is a Thracian cloak, just like we saw the funny trousers in Rhesus and his soldiers a few slides earlier. This patterned cloak, called a zavra, was iconographically Thracian. This was one of the ways a Greek artist could use shorthand to say, this is a Thracian thing we're talking about here. The boots that this rider is wearing seem to be the sort of fawn skin boots that Thracians tended to wear, especially when they show up in Greek art. Now, what's interesting about this isn't that we have someone depicted in Thracian clothing. We see lots of examples of that, but that this doesn't appear to be a Thracian. He doesn't have the kinds of other attributes that barbarians tend to have in vase painting, like pointy beards and so on. And also, there's an inscription on this vase that says Liegros Kalos, which roughly translated means Liegros is hot, or Liegros is beautiful. Now, there are lots of these so-called Kalos vases, and it's often difficult to tell whether the message of this person is beautiful is supposed to refer to the person actually depicted on the vase, or if it's just generally saying, this guy I know is good looking, or everybody thinks this guy is good looking. But it's not unreasonable to think that this might be Liegros himself, who we know from other sources was a famous good-looking youth in Athens. And it seems that Liegros and many other elite Athenians liked to wear Thracian clothing or otherwise display Thracian attributes in such a way that it was almost a marker of their elite status. So you here have this people that later Thucydides would describe as more or less the stereotypical uncivilized barbarians conducting a horrible massacre. You have a group of elites that see Thracian accoutrements as status symbols, as ways to advertise their elite nature. So it's a very interesting phenomenon to see the Athenians latching on to this foreign people in this particular way, not just as mercenary soldiers and so on, but also as sort of fashion icons, or as a really fashionable way to advertise one's special status. One of the most famous invocations of the Thracians in Greek literature comes from the very opening scene of Plato's Republic, perhaps the most famous and influential work of Greek philosophy ever written. It begins with Socrates, the main character in most of Plato's dialogues, setting the stage by saying he was making his way back from the Piraeus, the port of Athens, where he went with some friends to see a festival to the goddess Bendis, who was more or less the Thracian version of the Greek goddess Artemis. And they went down and watched the processions, which included a display from Greeks in honor of the goddess, but also a display of Thracians in honor of the goddess. And we are told in other places that the Thracians were the only foreign group of people given property and the right to build a temple to their goddess in the Piraeus, in Athenian territory. On the left in this image, we see a dedication to this goddess where Bendis is standing wearing the typical Thracian clothing. Here she has a typically Thracian hat as well, something called the alopekis, and a Thracian cloak. This, of course, is no longer showing any visible paint, but was likely painted in antiquity, and wearing these calfskin boots as she greets her worshippers. On the right, we see the Munichia harbor, where today the Admirals Club sort of juts out into the harbor, but this was the spot of this temple to a Thracian goddess in the famous port of the Piraeus, where we know that lots of Thracians lived as foreign residents of Athens. But as you've noticed, and as I signaled at the beginning of this talk, all of the sources we've dealt with so far are Greek sources. More particularly, they're all Athenian sources, which is often the case for a lot of Greek history, and of course, for the Greeks' interaction with non-Greek peoples, most famously the Persians, with authors like Herodotus, but also for the Thracians, the Scythians, and several other non-Greek peoples. So here on the left, we have perhaps the Greekest of all monuments, the frieze from the Parthenon in Athens, depicting Athenian citizen horsemen taking part in the Pan-Athenaic procession. The rider on the right is wearing Thracian clothing, just like Liegros was a few slides earlier. And as you can see on the right, this is the cover of my first book that dealt with this topic, and the reason why I was invited to participate with you today and to write an essay for the catalog for this exhibition. I delved deeply into these interactions between Athenian elites and Thrace and Thracians. But I did so mostly from an Athenian perspective, using Athenian literary sources, artistic sources, material sources, and so on. And so is it possible to move beyond this Athenian or even more broadly Greek perspective to get an idea of who the Thracians were in their own right, as people that, of course, had their own agency, had their own ideas of themselves, their own reasons for interacting with the Greeks and others in their world? So let's sort of perhaps back up a little bit and define what we mean by the Thracians. So here is a map of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Central and Eastern Mediterranean, and Thrace is roughly what is encompassed by the square you see on the map. If you want to put it in terms of modern geopolitical borders, Thrace is mostly in modern Bulgaria. Pretty much the entire modern country of Bulgaria would have been in what the ancients considered Thrace. But there were also Thracians and Thracian areas in what is now modern Greece, in what is now Turkey, and in what is now Romania. So several countries of the Balkans and into Asia Minor, or what is now Turkey. But it's important to note that just like there was no nation state of Greece in antiquity, so ancient Greece and the ancient Greeks are by no means equivalent to the modern nation state and its borders of Greece, there was no ancient nation state of Thrace. As we'll see, there were some periods in which there were powerful kingdoms of Thracians, and Thracia was a Roman province, which included a lot of this area we see here, but there was no one people or one nation of Thracians. One of the ways we can distinguish Greeks from other peoples in the ancient world is the speaking of Greek, or a form of the Greek language. There were several dialects and variants of the Greek language. The Spartans spoke a different dialect than the Athenians, for example, who spoke a different dialect from the Thebans, and so on. But they all spoke a version of Greek, And they all had common religious, cultural, and other practices that they could point to when they were deciding that they were actually related to each other as an ethnicity of some kind. That doesn't seem to be the case for the Thracians. The Thracians seem to have been many different language groups, cultural groups, and so on, who probably didn't see themselves as members of the same people. They certainly weren't so politically, but even on a cultural level, there were great differences, including, as I said, in terms of language. And we don't know whether they would have, any of these peoples would have called themselves Thracians at all. Thracians is what the Greeks and later the Romans called them. And if we think to our theoretical approaches to how we think about other people, I was heavily influenced, as very many people have been, by the work of Edward Said, who in 1979 wrote a book called Orientalism, in which he discussed and described and interrogated the practice that many of us who live in the, quote, West, how we approach and think about those who live in what we call the East. And we tend to think of the East as a monolith, as unchanging, as just one group of people that live in an exotic and strange and different place than we do. When in fact, as we know, the East is hundreds of nationalities, cultural groups, linguistic groups, cultural traditions, geopolitical boundaries that express their cultural, social, political lives in vastly different ways from each other. And similarly, the ancient Greeks and later the Romans grouped many different peoples into the general basket of Thrace and the Thracians. And so when we come to answer who were the Thracians, in many ways we can say that there weren't really any such people as the Thracians. There wasn't certainly any single ethnicity or nation or state that we can label Thracians. That said, there was a general there were some general similarities among the groups of people that lived in this region that the Greeks and Romans called Thracians, even if the boundaries and barriers were relatively fluid. So one way we could identify the Thracians is by what we call the Odrysian Kingdom. There was a group of Thracians called the Odrysians, and they and their kings came to dominate and unify much of the area that we now consider and the ancients considered to be Thracian into a single kingdom. Rulers with names like Seuthes and Cottus and Sitalkes and so on. And we'll actually, if you visit the exhibition at the Getty, you will see silver cups with names of these Thracian kings like Cottus inscribed in them. And so the Odrysian kingdom of Thrace arose in the 5th century BCE, so the 400s, and lasted up until, in some variation or another, up until the time of Alexander the Great, 150 years or so later, but also Thracian kings that considered themselves Odrysians interacted with and dealt with and fought against and sometimes with the Romans centuries later. But even the Odrysian kingdom of Thrace, which was the only sort of entity that we could think of today as a Thracian state of any kind, encompassed many different groups. It was simply the Odrysians, or their rulers in particular, that dominated and included in one political entity these other groups of Thracians. So even the Odrysian kingdom of the Thracians was not all Odrysians. We might more accurately think of it as an empire in which one people controls several other subordinate peoples. But the Odrysian kingdom forms the geographical basis of what would eventually become a Roman province, the Roman province of Thrace or Thracia. And we see two examples of Roman material culture in Roman Thrace on the screen right now. So on the left we see a theater from the time of Trajan in a city called Philippopolis, which should also signal to us that even by the time the Romans showed up, other peoples were already dominating this region. Philippopolis, of course, named after Philip of Macedonia, who was the king of peoples to the west of the Thracians. And that is in modern Plovdiv today in Bulgaria. And on the right, we have a Roman amphitheater in what is now Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, but which was in antiquity called Serdica. So we see here that in terms of material culture, the process of Romanization was quite advanced in many of these places, and we see several sort of marquee items of what it means to be part of the Roman world showing up in this region. Now, the Thracians themselves were not a literary people. They did not write works of history like the works of Thucydides we started today's talk with. And they also didn't tend to write down inscriptions like the Greeks and later the Romans did. And so we don't know any of the Thracian languages. We can't read Thracian. Most of the inscriptions we have, even if they have things like Thracian names on them, use Greek letters, for instance. But those Thracians we do know about from archaeological excavation, from art historical sources, tend to be, as is often the case, Thracian elites, Thracian kings and nobles. And so the sorts of Thracians, we sometimes hear about them in groups, like these groups of mercenaries in Greek sources, but the sorts of Thracians we know by name, or at least the names that the Greeks, as the Greeks rendered them, tend to be kings or princes or rulers of some kind. And we do know quite a bit about some of these rulers, including the figure we see on the screen here, Seuthes III, who was one of these Odrysian kings who seems to have tried to fight against the Macedonians in the time of Alexander. It wouldn't work out for Seuthes in terms of winning his complete independence. Thrace would continue to stay under the power of Alexander and his successors. But we have a lot of material from these Thracian rulers who, it seems, not only influenced the Athenians, but also hired Greek artisans and artists to create for them fantastic objects of gold, of silver, of other precious materials, as these Greeks also seem to have influenced and interacted with local Thracian craftspeople and artists as well. So this bronze image we see here of Seuthes really does resemble Greek work of the same period, that is the late 300s BCE. And Seuthes had a city named after himself in modern Bulgaria called Seuthopolis, and near Seuthopolis, in the town of Kazanlak, also in Bulgaria, is the so-called Kazanlak tomb, which would have housed another of these Thracian elites, if not a Thracian king in its own right. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It represents what's called a tholos or beehive tomb that is fantastically painted in a style that looks very much like the tomb paintings that we find in Macedonian tombs in places like Vergina in Greece. What we have depicted here is the funerary feast of an elite Thracian couple and a procession in their honor, including a chariot. This, of course, brings to mind, at least it does to me, the prized horses of poor Rhesus, who was killed in the Iliad. However, Thracians also represented the lowest stratum of the social ladder, especially in Greece. Greece, as you will know, was a slave-owning society, and many of the enslaved persons subject to unfree labor in the Greek world came from those areas of the Aegean and Mediterranean on the periphery of the Greeks, and many of those were Thracians. So Thrace was a source of mercenaries. It was a source of cultural inspiration. It was also a source of enslaved persons. And here we see some fragments from what are called the Attic stelae, which are an account of property confiscated from a bunch of ne'er-do-wells in Athens during the Peloponnesian War. And this includes lists of enslaved persons, and a very high percentage of these enslaved persons on the inscriptions are themselves Thracians. And Thracians would often be almost stereotypically enslaved in literary and artistic sources as well. One of the most famous Thracians in the ancient world was himself enslaved, and that is Spartacus. Spartacus was from Thrace, the ancient sources, which of course are all Greek and Roman, not Thracian, and come from a century or so after his death. Spartacus, in the 1st century BCE, is said to have come from a nomadic Thracian people, so people that are pastoralists or animal herders instead of living in the kind of settled communities that Greeks and Romans should live in. And then at one point seems to have fought as a Roman auxiliary soldier and then perhaps deserted, only to be enslaved as a consequence of that and made a gladiator. And I should tell you that there was an actual type of Roman gladiator called the Thracian or Thrakes. But interestingly enough, Spartacus was not this type of gladiator, even though famously he was a Thracian. He was what's called a myrmelo, which has a large shield and a straight sword. But Spartacus and several fellow gladiators famously broke out of their gladiator school and sparked a slave rebellion in Italy in 70s BCE that very nearly came within reach of Rome itself and took several years and several Roman armies to deal with. But on the other end of the social scale, at least one Roman emperor was also Thracian. In the 3rd century CE, we have the name of an emperor, Maximinus Thrax, that came to power in the 3rd century. But one way, and I'll end with these thoughts today, there are ways that we can start to understand what the everyday lives of Thracians were like, especially as they interacted with the other peoples in their world. And one way we can do that is through emporia, which is the Greek word for trading posts, because archaeological excavation has for years now been studying several of these trading posts where Greeks and Thracians interact with each other on a daily basis, both in terms of trade and commerce, but also it seems sharing religious practices, sharing cults with each other, and intermarrying and becoming sort of a people that just encounter one another and interact and influence one another on a day-to-day basis. And there are 2 of these trading posts that I want to mention. One, on the bottom of the screen here, is at a place called Molivoti in Greece, which is on the Aegean coast. The other is at a place called Pistiros near Vetrin in Bulgaria, which is several hundred kilometers inland and in the heartland of Thrace, where the Greeks set up a trading post right amongst their Thracian posts. So Pistiros, the inland settlement, we can see here is fascinating for several reasons, not least of which we have this great confluence of Thracian and Greek material culture coming together. We see Thracian names, we see Thracian local pottery, we see Greek amphorae, or these vessels that carry Greek goods for trade, all in the same place. But it's most famous because there's an inscription in Greek found in its vicinity in 1990 that actually carefully outlines the privileges that the Greeks living in the heartland of Thrace at Pistiros were given by a Thracian king in the region, one of these Odrysian kings of Thrace. It's the only inscriptional document of its kind from the ancient world where we can see how a Thracian ruler interacted with Greeks in this very interesting cross-cultural situation. in which they found themselves. And then similarly on the coast of the Aegean, Molivoti, which seems to have been, it's excavators, a joint project between the Greek Ephoria and Princeton University, have identified as ancient streamy. Here as well, we find evidence of Thracian pottery. Thracian names are showing up in what is a Greek settlement. And prior to this Greek settlement in this region, Thracian inhabitants lived here and farmed and so on before the arrival of the Greeks, and then the kinds of interactions that took place there. And so I end with these two cases where regular Greeks and regular Thracians interacted, because I want to think about this idea of the Thracians as being a society on the periphery, a peripheral people in the Greek world. This idea that there's a core where all the action happens and all the important people and events take place, and that there are peripheral peoples who just sort of interact once in a while with the core, but everything is determined by their relationship to the core. I think you can get closer to the situation of how everyday Greeks and everyday Thracians thought about the world and interacted with the world when we look at these archaeological sites like Pistiros and Molivoti, where we see just living together day by day, worshiping similar gods or influencing each other to worship perhaps entirely new or novel hybrid versions of gods, intermarrying, having kids together, exchanging goods. And I don't think that it's fair to think about peoples living in these kinds of situations as being peripheral in some sense. In many ways, the Thracians, of course, like all peoples in the ancient world, had their own agency and ideas about the world. And what's wonderful about the current exhibit at the Getty is we see the ways that these Thracians expressed their identities, expressed themselves as Thracians, even though we don't have a Thracian Thucydides any more than Thucydides himself was Thracian to tell us literarily how they thought about the world. So thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for this fascinating and really, really intriguing introduction to an ancient people, or as you say, several ancient peoples we call Thracians, to us today. And we have time for some questions. There are plenty of questions in the Q&A. Some of them have already been answered in writing, but I will channel a few, as many as we can get to, which will not be all, I'm afraid, to you, Matthew. And I start with one that asks about, are there any known archaeological sites that have not been explored as of yet in the area that we call Thrace?
Of course, yes. Thank you, Jens, and thank you to whoever asked that question. Of course, there are archaeological sites that we know are archaeological sites. We know that a settlement was there, or there's a tomb or a monument that haven't been excavated yet. In Thracian lands, places like Bulgaria, often you will see actual mounds of earth where we know something like that Kazanluk tomb is buried. Unfortunately, because they're still visible in the landscape, many of these have been since antiquity looted, although many of them have not been scientifically or systematically excavated. And it all comes down to whether or not there are resources and opportunities for scholars to do so. And so the hope is that exhibitions like this one will generate interest in the places where the Thracians lived, so that ministries of culture in countries like Bulgaria will put more resources behind. They're already doing quite a bit of excavation in Bulgaria, but increasing the funding, because these things take a lot of money, to excavate these sites in order to scientifically study and certainly learn much more about this people. And these peoples, rather. So yes, there are unexplored sites that we know exist, and there are certainly several that we don't know, and these kinds of excavations might reveal.
There is another question from the same viewer, which I think you answered in your talk already. So I'm going on to the next questions. Someone asked, was there retribution against the Athenian commander of the marauding Thracians? And I think that refers to the Mycalessus.
Yes. Yeah, no, not that we know of at all. In fact, he seems to have come from a prominent family, and there's no, and it continued to be prominent, and there's no indication that the Athenians would have censured him or arrested him or fined him or anything of that sort at all. The Athenians committed several massacres themselves during the course of the Peloponnesian War, and Thucydides commenting on this seems to be blaming or calling to reflection his fellow Athenians. And one of the reasons he would do that is because too many Athenians would have seen really no problem in what these Thracians and their commander had done.
Another viewer wants to know whether the Mycalessus disaster was worse than what befell Milos. And I think he refers to the siege of the island in the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah, so Milos, of course, was besieged by the Athenians, and when it was defeated, the Athenians killed all the men of military age and enslaved all the women and children. This is also one of the paradigms that Thucydides puts up of the kinds of things the Athenians were doing to their conquered enemies. Thucydides says it was worse. Thucydides says, of course, tells us about both disasters, that what happened to Mycalessus was the most pitiable thing that happened in the entire war. Now, in terms of numbers, Milos probably involved more, and then the Athenians actually then just colonized the island. So the thoroughness of the destruction perhaps was more at Milos, and it involved more people. But in terms of just sheer suddenness and horror and just butchery, I think Mycalessus was worse. We could, of course, debate whether killing someone is worse or less worse than enslaving them, but it seems the Thracians just massacred everyone at Mycalessus in a way they didn't at Milos.
The next question. Thracians were numerous and fearsome. I cannot imagine, says the viewer who asked the questions, them assimilating that easily to the Greeks or the tribes that invaded the Balkans. I read that they show up in historical accounts up until the 5th century CE or AD. Even some of the languages they spoke were attested in the later 4th and 5th century CE. What is your opinion of their fate?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a difficult one to answer. In terms of assimilation, I would entirely agree that I think a lot of local identity, local language, cultural practices would have continued. And this was a part of even the Roman world that the Romans didn't always find easy to maintain control over. So the neighboring region of Dacia and Moesia, which would have included Thracians as well as other people like Dacians, etc. The Romans eventually had to abandon because it was simply too hard to keep control of. And yeah, Thracian material culture, as you say, continues, and there are signs of Romanization. But I do think that local forms and traditions would have persisted largely. What we tend to see when we see Romanization is it's the rulers who want to portray themselves in such a way that would give them credibility amongst Greek or Roman audiences. Whereas the local people just living in Thrace, would have had, I think, less reason to put on those kind of outward signs of being like Romans or Greeks. In terms of their fate, that this area of the world has experienced many different invasions back and forth throughout the centuries, including the arrival of the Bulgarians themselves much later than the period we're dealing with today. So it's hard to tell, where the Thracians ended up, or whether there was any kind of limit to them as peoples living in the region.
There are quite a few questions aimed at sort of the ethnicity and the ethnic profile of Thracians. So here's one about the relationship between Thracians and the Dacians in the north of the Transylvanian Alps. Can you sort of also, the viewer says, looking at the Thracian treasures, all of them seem to be at the south of the Transylvanian Alps, but not to the north. However, we know from, sorry, this goes away. So we know from Herodotus that Dacians and Thracians are supposed to be related.
Yes.
Can you say something about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, the Greeks in many places call the peoples living at the southern shore of the Black Sea or in western Turkey Bithynian Thracians, or the Thracians in Asia. So there were Thracians from north of the Danube, and there were Thracians even in Asia. And so it depends who you talk to, who you ask. I will defer to a recent exhibition called The First Kings of Europe. I saw it at the Field Museum in Chicago in January, and several of the same objects are now part of this important exhibition at the Getty, which deals with Iron Age peoples, especially rulers, all across the Balkans, in what is now Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and other places. And there do seem to be some similar material forms in how the elite represent themselves, similar weaponry, gold helmets, masks, these kinds of things. So there does seem to be a sort of cultural environment in which there's exchange and influence with each other in terms of where the racial or ethnic boundaries are. I don't think that would be possible to determine, given that even within the core of what we're thinking of Thrace today, there would have been several different groups. So was there genetic kinship between Thracians in places further north and further to the west? I'm sure there were, but there were certainly cultural interactions and similarities that we see in terms of the objects on display in these kinds of exhibitions.
So there are several questions that sort of like hinting at the same direction. So I'm now trying to summarize to getting, to see that everyone gets a little bit of an answer before we conclude. And there's a couple of questions about Samothrace. What is Samothrace, or can you talk about it?
Yeah, so Samothrace, it's a very interesting name, right? Like this idea that it's like Samos and Thrace together. So Samothrace is an island in the northern Aegean, the northeastern Aegean, most famous for its cult of the great gods, Greek cult. But it is, the name doesn't mean that it was itself Thracian. It's kind of one of these false friends, in my understanding of the term. But that said, it interacted with the Thracians, and in fact, Samothrace was part of the trade networks that included the Emporia I talked about at the end of the talk, and it also settled much of the mainland across from it on the northern Aegean coast. And so there were interactions in terms of exchange, religious influence, and so on between Samothrace, the Samothracian Greeks, and those Thracians that lived on the shore right across from them. And also there was the Thracian presence prior to the Greeks, if I'm not mistaken, on Samothrace itself. But the name is, I think, more suggestive than I think it really was.
You talked about language and texts, and there are several questions asking about that as well. And one person, I think, articulated it well. It says, is it the absence of many texts about the Thracians written by them from their own perspective the key reason we still do not know much about them today?
Yeah, that is a key reason, if not the key reason, right? So there are two reasons we tend to know more about some peoples than others. And one of the main ones is we tend to focus on who has left us not just sources, but a certain kind of source. And so we think about the Greeks and the Romans because there's a whole bunch of Greek and Latin literature. And educational systems tended to focus on reading great texts like Homer or Virgil or Herodotus or Tacitus, and so on. And so a lot of it is just a function of, yes, those are the texts that have survived, but we also, I think, focus too much on them. And those texts also just tell us about a certain kind of Greek and Roman. Don't tell us about non-elites. They don't tell us about Greeks and Romans living in places that aren't dealt with in these texts. But that said, yes, the Thracians didn't leave us literary works of their own, and very few things by way of inscriptions on coins and on stone. But I think exhibitions like this one reveal that there's still a whole heck of a lot of things we can learn about them, just on a material basis, in terms of their jewelry, their art, their burials, their settlements. And I think we're starting to right this ship. We're starting to focus on those areas that have been traditionally neglected because their sources are different than the ones that we've tended to think were more useful or interesting or important for some kind of idea of educational formation. So I don't think we should be held back by the lack of texts. I think excavation will reveal even more than it has already, and now that we're focused more on it.
Speaking of excavations, I come to what I think is going to be our last questions. That's the question. The Greeks traded with the Scythians in Crimea, so they likely had safe ports along the coast of what is called Thrace. Any excavations you know of that support this?
That's a great question. I'm actually not sure. There's no evidence that the Thracians themselves were a maritime people. So the Thracians tended to trade via rivers, and with maritime peoples like the Greeks. And we do know that the Thracians and Scythians interacted in many ways and on several occasions. But I actually don't know the answer to what archaeology tells us about the Thracian and Scythian sort of maritime connections in terms of the ports they used and so on. That's a very interesting point.
And I conclude with one final question that points into the modern period. Are there remnants of the Thracian language in modern languages like Romanian, Greek, or Bulgarian?
I am not a linguist, but I would suspect that certain things like toponyms, like names of places, names of mountains, and that thing might survive. But as far as I know, we have no sense of Thracian survivals in modern languages. Romanian, of course, is a Romance language because the Romans colonized that region in the 2nd century. But whether and the extent to which there are Thracian sort of survivals in there, I actually don't know the answer to that. I suspect we haven't detected very many of them, if any at all, but that would certainly be a fascinating thing to discover.
Well, I think this brings us to the point where we need to wrap up our program. I think we had a huge audience, questions coming in hard and fast. We can possibly answer them all, but I think, Matthew, you did pretty well in the ones we got to. I want to thank Matthew again for illuminating us today in this also entertaining and very eloquent and erudite way. And I want to thank viewers, all of you, for watching, tuning in, submitting your questions. And I encourage you to visit the Getty Villa in person while our exhibition on Ancient Thrace is on display. As I said, this will be until, and it's on the screen right now, until March 3rd, 2025. And it also has the link getty.edu where you can find information of how to plan your visit. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Matthew, and goodbye, and see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure.